Oh yeah, we're gonna talk about it. What's up everybody? Brett with Brazin Scale RC back with you today. Today we're going to be talking about aftermarket chassis and comparing some competitive chassis to the Brazen stuff. The question that comes up this time of year, usually starting this time of year, that we see a bunch of times a week, a bunch of different answers to it, is what chassis is the best. And today we're just going to compare each one of these chassis that I have on hand here today. I've got the 4 offerings from Brazen that we currently offer. I've got 2 G-Speed chassis, and I've got a Toyzuki V2, and I also have a Vanquish VS410 Origin chassis here. So those are the ones we're going to be comparing today. I do have other chassis that are currently built in running trucks that I will be taking those apart and comparing those to the chassis that we have here also, but I just didn't really feel like taking the trucks apart right now. So I'm going to switch over to the workbench here and get started on comparing these chassis. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is start off by showing you guys the 4 different current Brazen chassis offerings that we have. Starting at the top here, this is going to be our oldest chassis that we currently offer. This is our Team Edition chassis. This one came out in 2016. We actually developed this chassis in 2015 and tested it for almost a year before we released it to anybody, but so that is still a popular chassis for us, still a very competitive chassis for us. It works really well. This is our hoopless or Class 1 type chassis. Obviously this is a G10 chassis, so it is not Sorca C1 legal, but we do offer this chassis in aluminum and steel and in stainless steel. So if you are a Sorca comp guy and you want to run Class 1 with an aftermarket chassis, this will fit your build pretty well. This chassis also is a direct bolt-on replacement for SCX 10.2 chassis. The only thing you'll need to modify when transferring SCX 10.2 pieces over to this is the sliders need to be trimmed, and you may need to lengthen your panhard bar a little bit depending on your setup. This is what we originally released as a 10.2 chassis. Basically it's the same as this C1 chassis, but it has integrated shock hoops front and rear, has a little bit extra clearance back here in the rear area, and it offers mounting holes for Toyzuki V1 forward motor mount, the G10 forward motor mount. All of these chassis have the same belly area and upper link risers and the same angle coming up off the back of the skid. They all share that feature. It works really well for us. We did a lot of testing and tuning and tweaking to figure out the length that we wanted, the ratio we wanted for the rear lower link to upper link lengths to make the trucks work well. So we kind of share that belly across the platforms. This is our latest chassis, the all-time low. This chassis will allow you to run your SCX 10.2 parts, or we offer TRX4 conversion parts for this. We have a TRX4 conversion skid plate that you can use with these whole patterns in the chassis are all SCX 10, SCX 10.2 based. So our conversion chassis takes that TRX4 transmission and mounts it in a custom flat skid plate that we designed to bolt up to any SCX 10 chassis. We also offer the cross braces with the servo mounts and rear chassis bracing and a couple different sizes of slider trays, and you can also run a forward motor mount on this chassis if you want. This is set up for the Toyzuki VS410 forward motor mount. One thing to note, if you plan on running a VS410 forward motor mount with this chassis, is you have to run a front differential or a front axle with an offset differential. The motor placement on the VS410 forward motor mount is right in the middle basically, so you have to have an offset front diff so you have clearance for drive shafts and things like that. So these 3 chassis I'm going to set to the side here. I'm going to grab the G-Speed V2 and G-Speed V3 next. It's not super publicized, but it's not really a secret either, but up until very recently we produced G-Speed's G10 chassis for them. So chances are if you have a G10 G-Speed chassis, it came from here. You know, we all work pretty well together behind the scenes, regardless of how it may appear on Facebook, but we all work together pretty well. So anyway, this is the G-Speed V2 chassis. I don't believe this is in production very much anymore, if at all. He's pretty much switched everything over to the V3 now, but comparing the V2 to the V3 here, if we lay them out on top of each other, the front bumper height and the rear bumper height are the same. Shock mounting locations are pretty similar. With the V3, you get a lot more clearance in the front of the belly and the back of the belly, which is nice to help you not get hung up on stuff. Personally, with our chassis and our trucks, like I said before, we worked quite a bit on link placement here. Rear link placement is different on the G-Speed chassis here than our chassis and compared to each other. Personally, I think he did a better job with the V3, moving the rear upper links closer to the transmission, making them a little bit longer. That seemed to help on our setup, so that's nice. On the V2, depending on your transmission setup, you may have had to clearance the side of the chassis here. There's an awful lot of material there, so you may have had to grind that out or trim it out to clear a transmission or a motor. I know we've had customers in the past, and I've even ran into it myself, running a very large motor that really doesn't fit in this area. So even on his V3, the amount of room you have in between the upper link mounts is drastically shorter than ours, so you may even need to trim some of this out, but that's not a super common thing. It's kind of if you're running weird setups or things like that. Comparing the G-Speed V3 to the all-time low, he does have an angled skid on this, so it is a little bit difficult to show you guys how that compares completely, but you can see the belly lengths are pretty similar. This chassis is a blemish, and it is blemished right at the front of this radius here, so it's going to appear a little bit more clearance here than it really is. But I'm going to lay the all-time low on top of it here so you can see the height difference or clearance differences in the front end and rear end here. You can see the front bumper height on the all-time low is about a ½ inch taller, and the rear bumper height is also about a ½ inch taller than the G-Speed. You'll also notice right up in the shock hoop area we have a ton more clearance here. That is because we based this chassis off of portal axles, really. You got a lot more clearance front and rear here for these big portal axles that are the current rage, but that does not deter at all from running non-portal axle trucks. It just gives you some extra clearance. This clearance right here at the rear of the front bumper mount area is somewhat critical to us when we run super low trucks for steering shafts, tie rods and steering rods and things like that, and get fouled up on the chassis there. You'll see guys clearancing the chassis for it, but not really an issue with this chassis. So, all right, we will move on to the Toyzuki V3 or V2 now. Now this is an original V2. It's one of the first V2s that came out. He does have a V2.5 and a V3 now. I don't personally have them here, so it's kind of hard to compare. The Toyzuki chassis is a little bit complicated for beginners. That's not to say that it's not easily buildable, because the Toyzuki fan page on Facebook is full of dudes that are totally willing to give you every pointer, every tip, every piece, part, nut, bolt, screw, gear, whatever that you need to figure these things out. And setup on them, again, is pretty easy because of the help that's on these fan pages. There are a lot of pieces to the Toyzuki chassis, but the nice thing is it comes with all of them, other than a couple of gears and shafts, but you know, those are all stock axial parts, so they're not that hard to get a hold of. This chassis, unfortunately, I don't really have an offering to compare this chassis to. Ben spends a lot of time with comp-oriented and high-performance-oriented stuff, and so laying this chassis on here, it doesn't compare at all. Shock mounts don't line up at all. Skid plates don't line up at all, other than the basic hole pattern. But angled skid to flat skid. We have tons of high clearance areas on our chassis where he really doesn't here. I know the V3 chassis has a ton more clearance for portal axle trucks. So if you're at all considering running a portal axle truck, don't buy the V2. Buy the V3. It's a much better chassis for what you want to set up. But again, guys, this chassis really doesn't compare to much. If you take the G-Speed and lay it on top here, again, there's really no comparison here. The Toyzuki appears to be about 3/4, maybe a little bit less than 3/4 of an inch overall length longer than any of the other chassis offerings. The amount of shock mount and link mount locations on this chassis allows for a great wheelbase change in the rear. With the front wheelbase, you're kind of limited as to what you can do because of drive shaft clearances and motor clearances and link clearances and things like that. But man, he's got a bunch of room back here for you to stretch that rear axle out a little bit. Even the G-Speed V2, it doesn't really compare. There's really no comparison to any of that there. That brings us to the Vanquish VS410 Origin chassis. Now the VS410 Origin chassis has some high clearance areas for portal axles, and it does have built-in upper link risers. This is the only stamped chassis that I have on hand to show you guys, so take note of that. It is a stamped chassis versus a flat plate G10 chassis or anything like that. So I'm going to grab the Brazen C1 type chassis. Now we should be able to line these chassis up pretty well because the skid plate areas are pretty similar on these chassis. So you can see with the VS410 chassis, we do have more upper link adjustments front and rear there. We do have a little bit more clearance front and just about the same in the rear. Our bumper heights are drastically higher than the VS410 chassis is. And the all-time low chassis is even more drastic than the C1 is. So if you're looking for a ton of clearance over the VS410 chassis, and we have a much shorter belly here than this chassis does. In fact, I mean this Toyzuki chassis has the longest belly that I have here, and it's even shorter than the VS410 chassis is. So I guess the reason you guys are all here, what chassis is the best? And the answer is none of them. None of them are the best. There's no one single chassis here or available that is the end-all be-all chassis. There's a reason why there's so many offerings on the market. They all shine in different lights, and as you can tell from this video, they really don't even compare. At the end of the day, they all perform the same function. They're all based off the same vehicles, but man, your setup, it's drastically different. So if somebody had a G-Speed chassis and they weren't happy with it, and they decided to purchase a Brazen chassis, and they just transferred that exact same setup that they had on this, links, shocks, everything, it's going to drastically handle differently, better or worse. Same thing can be said for somebody that has a Brazen chassis and switches to a G-Speed. They may like it better. Josh from Harley Designs said the other day when he was talking about foam tuning, a lot of people will chime in and say, X setup is the best or X setup is the best. And while it more than likely performed better than stock for them, if they haven't really tested other products or spent time tuning and messing with things, then they may not be given the best information. So it's all personal preference again, guys, and it's all setup, it's all terrain, it's all in how you drive. Man, you can take the Nationals winning truck. You could take the crawl space contender that won nationals this year and put it in the hands of someone else and run that exact same course and do awful with it. So yeah, it all boils down to your setup, the way you drive it, and how well you know what that truck's going to do or not do. And if something doesn't work for you, don't be afraid to switch it up. You know, changing just the height that you mount your front or rear upper links drastically changes the way the vehicle runs. And then, you know, also you can change link separation on the rear axle. You can change link separation on the front axle. Shock locations, shock oils, shock weights. It's all kinds of stuff. So don't be afraid to mess around and play with these things, guys. That's, at the end of the day, that's what we're here for. So if you guys want to see some more comparison videos with other brand chassis, I've got a Corrupt Carbon Works, I've got a 149 RC Works, and I've got a GMRC Drag Queen. So if you guys want to see those chassis also compared to some of these, I'll have to disassemble the trucks and break everything down because they're currently running vehicles. But let us know in the comments what you guys think. If you guys want to see these trucks built with, you know, similar components, I've got a bunch of skid plates laying around. I've got a selection of different axles sitting around here. You know, we can loosely assemble these things and show you, you know, how these clearances affect things and what all with different axles and different shock packages too. So I'd prefer to start with doing that with just the Brazen chassis, showing you guys the differences between these, because again, there's really no end all be all what's the best chassis. So I hope this video was a little bit informative for you. And again, comment down below and let us know what you want to see on the next one.